Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us from all around the world today. We're going to give it about 60 seconds to let all of you enter our digital webinar space, and then we'll make a start. Okay, well, we're going to try and keep to time today, as we always do. So let's make a start. We've got a few more people joining us as I speak. And once again, it's great to have so many business aviation professionals gathered to share their knowledge, especially at these rather trying times that we're going through. Now, in our last webinar earlier this month, we considered the overall impact of the COVID-19 emergency on the business aviation sector. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into what's happening in the supply chain. And when I refer to the supply chain, I'm talking cradle to the grave. I mean every link in the chain, from when a new aircraft goes into production to how parts get sourced to keep an elderly aircraft flying towards the end of its useful life. Now, we want to address as many of your questions as possible in the time we have. If anyone has any questions, we'll be glad to get those from you now. And of course, you can keep posing questions as we're talking. We're going to spend about the first 40 minutes or so in open discussion with our panelists, and then we're going to start putting your questions into the mix. But before we get started with the discussion, let's wake everybody up with a short poll for all of you listening into this webinar. We'll keep the poll open for a minute or so, and you should be able to see it, but I'll read the questions. What disruption is to the business aviation supply chain are you seeing? Response 1, it's getting harder to receive parts and supplies when needed. Or 2, my company is finding it hard to supply goods and services to customers due to disruption to our workforce and facilities. 3, I've not experienced significant supply chain disruption. Or finally, no disruption so far, but I expect there will be in the future. The answers are flocking in now. We'll see what the consensus is here. Relatively even at the moment, I would say. Okay, that's pretty interesting. It's a fairly even split. I think what we would say is that close to half are, well, a quarter finding it definitely harder to receive parts and supplies, and almost the same number finding it hard to do the supplying. And then another quarter are saying no disruption so far, but they're expecting it. And then, around 30% saying nothing significant, nothing very significant so far. Which is quite a mix. And we'll drill into that with our panelists. Now, they have an extraordinary array of combined experience and knowledge between them. So let me just quickly introduce them, starting off with Aaron Hollander. He founded First Aviation Services just over 25 years ago. The group provides extensive repair and maintenance services, overhaul services, as well as managing the supply of rotable aircraft parts and components. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School and holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Next to him is Todd Winter. He's the president and CEO of Mid-Continent Instruments and Avionics, and he's also CEO of True Blue Power, the first company in the world to develop and TSO certify a safe lithium-ion main ship battery for aircraft. Under Todd's direction, Mid-Continent has entered new markets and expanded its manufacturing and service capabilities. Mid-Continent is a leader in the maintenance, repair, overhaul, and custom manufacturing of aircraft instruments, avionics, and power solutions. And Todd is a graduate of the Southern Methodist University's Cox School of Business. And last, but certainly not least, Mark Drobny. He became president of the Standard Aero Business Aviation Unit in March 2018, having previously been with NetJets' Aircraft Management and Charter Division Executive Jet Management for around 13 years. Standard Aero is a leading provider of airframe and engine maintenance, repair and overhaul, as well as engine component repairs, engineering services, and aircraft interior refurbishment and painting. By background, Mark served as a pilot in the US Navy, and he holds an aeronautical engineering degree from the Naval Academy in Annapolis. So first, I'm going to ask all of these distinguished panelists in that order to respond to some of the core topics we're trying to address today. So let's start out with you, Aaron. Where do you think are the pinch points in the supply chain? In your view, do you think there'll be any significant interruption or delay in new deliveries of aircraft? And from your perspective, is it starting to get harder to get the parts and the components where they need to be for maintenance and overhaul work?
Thank you, Charles, for putting this together. Reflecting on the question, I think we looked at the industry and the supply chain even prior to COVID and would describe it as a very fragile supply chain to begin with. And I think it could even be argued that the supply chain was in a fair amount of distress. Mm-hmm. Some of it is forced errors, some of it's unforced errors. The volumes that we produce by unit numbers are relatively low, even though it's a big industry, compared, say, to the auto industry. What we have is a good year of production. Many of the auto suppliers look at it as a production run. So we primarily going to focus on aircraft that's 5 to 30 years old. And it always amazes us that aircraft with a fairly reliable, predictable need for MRO components will almost every OEM have shortages in that supply chain. So we're analyzing it from that perspective, that it's already pretty fragile. And we've made the decision that we don't see how this is going to do anything but probably make it worse. And we at first said, well, maybe this will allow the OEMs to have a catch up, but we're really not sure. If you look at many of the suppliers, and it's a very deep supply chain, you have many people further down that food chain who are smaller operators. They may be undercapitalized. They may not have great succession plans. They're stressed by not having people there, or facilities being shut down. So we generally see it's going to be a challenge. But we do see the pony in it. For us, this is an opportunity because we make a very large percentage of the parts that we need in MRO ourselves. We have very good portfolio of PMA parts and DER repairs. And often when that supply chain breaks, it's an opportunity for us to make up the gap. So we're very cautious. We're building inventory where we can. But we think we see this is going to be fairly disruptive, and we may not see it for a number of months into the future.
Yeah, fair point, and thanks for being so candid. So, Todd, let's quickly go to you, if we may. Where do you see the pinch points? What degree of a problem is this really?
Well, again, thanks for having us on board. We're here to help as best we can. Today, we are fortunate to find that we are not creating a pinch point. So customers who are contacting us, whether it's for legacy support on aircraft components or new products that we supply to OEMs in the aftermarket, they're seeing no difference when they contact us to get components or to get deliveries. The only stress there is that many of the OEMs are concerned about the safety of their employees and or concerned about delivering new aircraft. So we have seen at least 4 weeks worth, maybe a 10 to 20% drop in demand for parts for new aircraft. As far as a pinch point, I think I agree with Aaron. We have been in very close contact with our supply chain, and so far we're really not seeing any big issues. 54% are having no problem. 34% are having slight delays, but nothing important. But we see that possibly changing in the future. So as we go out another 60, 90 days, we can see that some additional issues could be coming up, including we've seen some concerns about raw material that goes into, making mechanical components or cases, things that we use, aluminum, stainless steel, critical things, ball bearings, which was a big pinch point during World War II. That's still something that we use, and that's a highly specialized type of product. So we see possible pinch points in the future, and definitely for things that would be international supply. So similar to travel restrictions, we see pinch points in components possibly coming in from Asia, from China, in some cases from Europe. So we do see that would be a upcoming source of concern. Again, how does this affect raw materials? And finally would be the case where I've talked to some other executives in other businesses, and the other pinch point would be in factories where they may have to close down for periods of time to deal with COVID in their factories to protect their employees, to do decontamination. And in some cases, we're fortunate, our facilities lend themselves to a very safe operation and healthy spot, but not all factories are that way. So we see that being a possible pinch in the future as well.
Thank you, Todd. That's very useful. And so, in some respects, we haven't seen the full extent of this yet, and you're right to identify the sort of geographic complications that we'll get back to. So, Mark, over to you now. At Standard Aero, how's the view on the supply chain interruptions? Does it look any different from what your two colleagues have just described?
Yeah, I would very much agree with the points that Aaron and Todd raised, particularly the word fragile. I think the system overall has shown itself to be quite fragile. And, all of last year, we saw supply chain problems in certain materials, particularly forging and casting, where there are only so many suppliers. And really, due to demand, they were all pretty overwhelmed. All the OEMs on the engine side were having trouble delivering all of the material required by customers. And so that dynamic continues, and it's certainly not going to get any better very quickly. Those are things that take quite a long time to get into the supply chain, to get to get created and approved and go through all the quality processes. So this is not something you can spin up quickly. Specialty materials, anything that's really unique that was hard to find is going to be more painful. And I think there have been spots of underinvestment in terms of single sourcing supply or supply chain providers that really have exacerbated risk. It's a roll of the dice sometimes when those decisions get made, maybe for a time create opportunity for financial leverage, but when things become problematic, it really gets worse. So I think we're going to see where there is pinch, it's going to become more painful. At this point, COVID hasn't completely changed the dynamic, but as Todd just mentioned, certain factories being shut down, absolutely creating greater pinch points. Now, maybe a drop in demand for certain things might relieve some of the pre-existing supply chain strain, but I think that's going to be relatively short-lived, and like I said, the pinch points are going to become more painful. Maybe not more numerous, but more painful.
Yeah, ouch. Well, we've talked mainly so far about, I guess, sort of hardware and materials that are needed, but I think it's fair to say human resources are a no less critical part of the supply chain. So I'm going to go back to you, Aaron. Are the lockdown rules that are in so many parts of the world now, and the various travel and work restrictions, as well as sickness, making it harder to get the right skills where they need to be to keep aviation safe and viable? What have you seen in that regard?
Charles, I would expand it slightly to both human factors and human resources. I mean, we have the challenge that came up today about, do we move management from one facility to the other where there's assistance that's needed? Normally, we just get on the plane and go. And we're thinking really through that from a safety standpoint. I think the human factor side of it that we see in the supply chain, I would sort of describe it as confidence is the lubricant for the supply chain. And what I mean by that is if the vendors and suppliers very deep are not confident when the market's going to return, how it's going to return, are the orders they're getting real, it makes it very challenging to bring the system back up to whatever that level of demand is going to be. So I think both the human factors is an issue and the human resource, particularly for companies like us, being able to move our people around. We've got split shifts. We're doing everything we can to protect people. So they're both are a big challenge right now.
Fair enough. And Todd, what about your perspective on the human element in this, if you like?
Yeah, I think Aaron nailed it pretty well. It's certainly a challenge, and it's taken up a lot of resources as far as for my management staff and for the top people in my organization to deal with it. Although we've dealt with it pretty well, but again, we're very concerned about I almost hate to mention that we haven't had a case yet within our organization. We were roughly 200 employees. But our concern is, what happens when we have to go to a more extreme level of protection, and we feel like we put in the right protections. But absolutely, without the right people in our facilities and without the right people in our supply chain that are out there producing those parts, processing orders, shipping the components to us, it would certainly be a concern. It is a challenge, and it may actually add to cost at some point.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll talk about cost and market conditions in a minute. Mark, at Standard Aero, are you changing things to take account of the sort of the human element in the chain?
Yes, certainly. I think it's fair to say that we've made everyone's life a little bit more difficult here over the past couple of months, inducing inefficiencies just by having to take steps that we weren't previously doing in terms of cleaning or distancing, providing, protective gear or protective means to folks, changing the nature of visitors into our facilities and all these sort of things. And it definitely is harder to get the appropriate skills in place. Aaron mentioned, trying to share resources from one site to the next definitely has gotten more difficult, even though we continue to do it. And, one of the areas where it's become more difficult for us is field services, trying to get, technicians into the field to do repairs and service events has just become more difficult. Continuing to run that, 24/7, 365, but everything that has changed in the world in the past 2 months has just made that harder, whether it be shipping goods and material in place or getting people to where they need to be, and what are the right steps you need to take to make sure that people are protected, that they're being thoughtful about how they might be exposing themselves. All that stuff has just made life harder, for sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there's no doubt. Well, in a minute, we will talk about how the demand curve might have changed. But first, I'm going to ask all of you, you touched on some of the steps that can be taken to improve the process from a human point of view. But Aaron, starting with you, are there any other steps that companies can take to kind of iron out these kinks in the supply chain? Are you changing the way you do things? And are you able to make new technology come into play here?
Well, there's three things we're doing. I'd say the first two we've been doing before. One is being aggressive on inventory, be willing to invest in the inventory. And parts that we manufacture ourselves, we often keep a 1 or 2 year supply. We've had these issues before, like with the Fukushima disaster in Japan, that hurt some of our supply chain on the electronic side. So one is inventory, two is the engineering. We're beefing that up further so we can be as independent as possible. The third one, which we've never really had to think about before, but we have reached out to smaller suppliers and ask them, be candid. If you're having issues, let us know. Whatever we can help to keep you functioning, we will do. And we're open, we're coachable, so hopefully other people, when you open this up, have other ideas. But those are three that we're focusing on right now.
Sure. Yeah, good point. And Todd, what about you? Have you any sort of magic tricks to help this be less of a headache?
Yeah, we don't really have any. Yeah, no magic tricks, unfortunately. But we've definitely doubled down on communication. So in so many aspects, it's always been important. It's always been a huge part of what we do. So we've doubled down on that. And as we have concerns, I think we feel that our supply chain might be diversified enough where we can, if we have a shortage or a lack of something someplace, that we may have alternatives, a second source, if you will. That excludes certain things, though, and it's been hard to be a manufacturer in the United States these many years. Quite a challenge. So we're proud that we have succeeded with that, but we do supply on or depend on certain components, electronic components, and things like that. And in our case, actual lithium-ion battery cells, and all that manufacturing by market-driven pressure and cost has been shifted into Asia typically. But I also talked to a cohort yesterday in another large avionics company who does a lot in Mexico, and that's exposure. So on some of those, our abilities may be significantly limited. But also the ability, as we've seen people sharing resources and knowledge, that would be really the secret weapon for those of us who maybe previously were competitors, to be able to share resources and share knowledge. That sharing, that would be the magic.
Yeah, good point. Well, I appreciate that, and that's to a degree what we're trying to do today. And Mark, I'm just wondering from your point of view, one difference we're facing with this crisis today in 2020 versus if we were dealing with it, I don't know, back in the 80s or early 90s is, we have cloud-based systems, we have all sorts of sophisticated apps to help us have visibility. Is that making a difference? I mean, 20, 30 years ago, we'd just be kind of yelling at each other down the phone saying, where's my stuff? Help me, I need it now.
Yeah, I'd say sometimes it does help. Sometimes it feels like we're still in the 80s. It's very dependent on how robust those tools are, sort of supplier by supplier, manufacturer by manufacturer, and how accurate are they. As Todd mentioned a little bit ago, communication is key, and that's probably an answer you can apply to any problem in business. But just keeping the lines of communication open, taking advantage of the digital means that we do have today, to really make that communication be a minute by minute, day by day forum for us, and not just with the supply chain, but also with the customer base, and being as absolutely transparent as we can with customers about how supply chain stops and starts are affecting us, how it's going to affect our commitments to our customers, because they're at the end of the whip and they only know what we can tell them, and just trying to be as transparent as possible. has been helpful. What's going on has forced us to be selective in terms of inventory, as Aaron mentioned. Cash preservation is a big deal because we know that there are going to be opportunities created out of what's going on, and you need to be in a position to take advantage of them. So keeping some dry powder for whatever that might be needed for is definitely a key piece of strategy.
Yeah, good point. Okay, well, in a minute, we're going to go back to our audience with a second poll question. But first, let's just get back to this point about demand, because, of course, it's one thing to be struggling with how you keep the supply chain moving. But, of course, the COVID-19 virus has impacted trading conditions really very seriously indeed. Several of you alluded to the fact that, there may be a bit of breathing space and that demand may dip somewhat. So starting with Aaron, are you seeing that? And maybe you're also seeing sort of unusual fluctuations in demand that are hard to adjust to, the sort of aviation equivalent of people rushing to supermarkets and buying crazy amounts of things they normally buy in a perfectly normal way. Are you seeing much on that score, Aaron?
We are, Charles. We're in a number of different segments. So on the corporate, where landing gear is a very big part of our business, that is way over capacity. We're expanding hours, working 6 days a week. So that's doing really well. We're seeing that the grocery store phenomena of people saying, if my plane's going to be down for the next, who knows, 3 months, let's get the major maintenance done and behind us. So that's doing really well. The military business we do essentially unchanged. The regional airline business is obviously, very weak, down probably 50% or more. And then we're also in the helicopter rotor blade market, and in that segment, we're over capacity. And I think, as everybody knows who's on this call, this is a business that's very difficult to adapt for capacity. So we're seeing everything from trying to keep up with demand to trying to say, how do we keep really skilled people employed, doing training, looking at new product lines to get into.
Yeah, good point. What about you, Mark? Is this sort of showing up in the immediate bottom line from your perspective?
Definitely, I second the comments that Aaron made about sort of sector by sector. Military, we're being consistent. Business aviation being incredibly strong, and commercial airlines, obviously, as the airlines have gone to parade rest, their needs have dipped very sharply, and that forces us to react to their demands, and the stop and start, I think, will continue to be very sudden, and we're just going to have to respond to them as best we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, let's just check that our audience is still with us. It looks like they are. We're going to ask a second poll question here, and it's going to pop up for a minute, just like the first one. The question is this: are supply chain issues making goods and services more expensive due to fluctuations in supply and demand and logistical complications? So, simple question. Answer one, yes, costs are increasing, or answer two, no, the costs are about the same as before COVID-19. Answers flooding in, that's good. Nearly there. That's interesting. A pretty conclusive result there. So just under 1/3 say yes, costs are increasing, but actually 2/3 say that for now, costs are about the same for most of what people are buying. I find that interesting. Maybe it just means that the market hasn't settled down yet. But back to you, Aaron. From what you're seeing, are you seeing much change in what things cost? Are some things maybe getting less expensive as demand softens?
We're on the buy side, we're not really seeing much change at all. We are seeing some suppliers where we're helping them out in terms of paying quicker. On our sell side, we're not changing pricing at all. Our feeling is this is an industry with a very long memory, and people are going to remember if we try to take advantage of any of that. So we're not adjusting our price at all, even where there's very high demand.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And what about you, Todd? Do you think this situation is resulting in some sort of price instability? Do you think it will change the market for very long, or is it just a sort of a temporary interruption in terms of cost levels?
Well, this all came so quickly and so sudden for everyone across the globe. I don't really think people have had time to react yet. It's we may have all found ourselves where we're dealing with things, we're getting things under control, and then all of a sudden something pops up, and you're like, oh, maybe I didn't think about that before. So I think we haven't seen time to react. We haven't experienced anything significant. We have seen a few isolated cases. We have a number of machine part suppliers that are in the Northeast. We're still getting components, but we've seen in some cases some increases. I think it will lead to increases. I think the cost of doing business may well be impacted. Again, the next 6 to 8 months are unknown territory. And we've seen things that we never would have believed would happen. So
Yeah.
I think there is exposure to increased costs and it should be in certain types of products, maybe in certain areas of the country. A lot of people are thinking about, will we see more of our supply chain shift back into the US from Asia, for instance? And what would that mean? So yeah, I do think we have exposure for some increased costs in the future. I think we just haven't had time. Most people haven't had time to figure all that out because we're dealing with either survival mode situations or doing the things that have to be done today, this week, to continue to operate and take care of people.
Yeah, good point. And before we get back to that geographical issue, because that's something that several of our questioners are flagging up now, Mark, do you see the cost structure situation in pretty much the same way, or are you seeing something different?
The immediate impact is good old supply and demand. So there's certainly a cost bloat for PPE and things like hand sanitizer that you've seen just ridiculous costs for. But true material going into our projects hasn't really changed that much, except for where you see lack of a supplier able to supply product. Maybe they've shut a factory down, you have to go to a second source. Maybe you've seen some increased costs there, or you have a supplier who's concerned about the future of their business and trying to stimulate demand, providing some incentives right now on reducing costs. So not an across the board change just yet. I think when you look long term, how is this going to impact us? Certainly taking any steps to reduce risk in supply chain, I think will create some increases in cost. Bringing production, back on shore, or multi-sourcing supply, so it's not single source. That's going to probably create some increased costs. So overall, long-term impact, I think, will be increased costs. But right now, it's sort of a mixed bag depending on supply and demand.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Well, the final question that I had for you as a group, it's great because it actually overlaps with a lot of the questions that our audience are asking. And that is essentially, you know, in the longer term, when we can take a breath and say, well, we're somewhat behind this crisis, or we've got the crisis behind us, how is the supply chain going to change? How is its structure going to change? And several people are asking, you know, is it going to be viable in the future for people to have a really geographically dispersed supply chain? You know, what's going to happen if borders keep closing and travel plans keep getting interrupted? And other people are asking, you know, what's going to happen to that just-in-time mentality that we've all had of, you know, you can leave everything till the last minute and just assume that FedEx or somebody else is going to come through for you with what you need. So, Aaron, back to you. Are we going to see a different sort of shape and structure to the supply chain as a result of this, perhaps less overseas manufacturing and supply?
Well, for us, we sort of pulled out of Asia suppliers a number of years back. I think we only have one part that's made in Asia, but I think the industry is so integrated between Europe and the US. I just don't see that it's going to be that possible to make major changes. I think what might be more helpful, particularly for the OEMs, is to have the resources to be quicker at changing suppliers. Right now, they're so dependent on their suppliers, and it's so difficult for them to qualify a new supplier. It's just barrier after barrier that they don't really get to take advantage of companies that might be lower cost or better quality or faster turn times. And I think that might be one of the emphasis that one of the changes that might be there. But I don't think
is that a regulatory issue, you know, in terms of the choice that you have?
I think it's partly regulatory, and I think it's partly just being willing to invest in that part of the business when things are going well, and there's always rounds of reductions and reducing cost. You know, that's an easy place to cut, and you don't see it. You won't see it for years. But I think right now it's very hard for many suppliers to get qualified, and I think we're going to go back to it being, you're still going to be dependent on your supply chain, but you're going to have the ability to make changes quicker. I think that's probably one of the outcomes of this.
Yeah, good point. And Todd, what about you? Do you think the shape of the supply chain is going to change? Do you think we'll look back in a few years and say, can you believe that we all had 24 suppliers across 5 continents, and now look how we've rationalized it? Do you think change is coming there?
Well, I think Aaron's points are significant. One of the biggest costs of in the supply chain are certification and compliance. That used to be famous in our military products, right? With the whatever it was, the $5,000 toilet seat and the $1,200 hammer. So that is very significant. I think we will be forced to change, and the supply chain will be forced to change in certain areas, not necessarily across the board. Hopefully those changes will be productive. Will they add to cost? Possibly. I think the other thing is, as we mentioned, our volumes are not always attractive from a supply chain perspective. And we also coattail and rely on automotive and certain other industries to make it to where we can actually purchase products. And I have been very focused on new markets with the more electric aircraft, possibly even fully electric aircraft. And a lot of those technologies are poised to bring in disruptors and poised to require suppliers, new suppliers, and people that will be doing things very differently. And some of that would require, most likely, less certification and more flexibility in the supply chain, right? Things that would lead to value through disruption. And one of the quotes I invented, I believe, for my people earlier was that chaos can breed success in the future, and innovation. So it'll be interesting to see how this spurs innovation and in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very, very good indeed. And then I'm conscious of the time here, so I want to start segueing more into our our audience's questions. Several people are asking essentially, you know, what about just in time? What about the technology that sort of enables just in time? Somebody's asking here, you know, what about the future of e-commerce? You know, will we have to change our expectations in terms of the timelines under which stuff gets supplied? So let's move that topic around. Mark, what do you think about that? Is it just a change of philosophy, or a, you know, change of how we actually physically do things that's needed?
Well, that's a broad question. I certainly think there need to be adaptations, and we're going to have to reset our expectations in certain ways. It will be very dependent on the choices that different businesses make about their desire and or ability to make changes to their supply chain. The other guys mentioned the regulatory burden and the length of time it takes to make changes. That's a big deal for the industry. There are technologies like 3D printing that have already started to massively change the dynamic on timing of delivery of goods that we've probably only scratched the surface of. And I think things like that will probably help facilitate the just-in-time dynamic. But I think there are some tough decisions that need to be made about a really distributed supply chain, and is that cost savings really worth the risk that it brings? And in some cases it'll be yes, in some cases no. In other cases, I expect that we'll make changes. We'll start to make changes, and then our memories will fade, right?
Yes.
We'll forget about these impacts 2 or 3 years from now, when we'll be back to some of our old ways.
Yeah, good. And Erin, back to you. Do you think this is going to change, you know, sort of customer mentality in terms of, you know, how quickly they expect stuff to be delivered to them and how quickly they expect services to be ready? Do you think they're perhaps going to have to plan more, you know, plan further ahead and plan to hold inventory? And in fact, you as suppliers too, are you going to have to change that mentality to just in time?
Well, I think just in time in terms of the supply chain, it's going to have to be managed. But in terms of expectations, I don't think so. I think, you know, particularly the younger people, they're used to hitting that button and get whatever they want the next day. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that's moved into our industry where, you know, we grew up saying, okay, if it took this amount of time, that's how much it took. I think that people compete, we compete in turn times, and that's not going to change. So we're going to have to just have the most robust supply chain we can, do the inventory, engineering, all the other things we've talked about. But I don't think I think people's expectations are going to be the same. They're going to want to see their gear done as quickly as possible, their engines done. You know, we're an operator as well, and we've got an asset that's expensive, and we want to see it flying. So I don't think so.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. And Todd, at Mid-Continent, do you expect this to change, you know, buying habits and how you respond to those in terms of timelines?
I think it depends on the market segment. So interestingly enough, before the pandemic, in my organization, we were already very, very focused on meeting that new expectation in what we consider the aftermarket. So the people operating airplanes, existing airplanes, helicopter fleets, such like that, discretionary or business aviation. So we were already addressing that, and now we've doubled down on that effort to make a big step in facilitating delivery, logistics, and distribution to our customers. With our very important segment of OEM customers, it's a little bit interesting because I have been pushed to do on-time delivery for many of those customers. And oddly enough, the way that I achieve that is by taking the opposite stance with my supply chain. So the way that I make sure that I can deliver batteries just in time, or even in cases repairs on radars and altimeters and autopilot systems, the way I do that is I carry a lot of extra inventory. And of course, today that's helped us out, but that's the way that I deal with that. So it's a little bit interesting. It's good for my OEM customers, and I understand that, but I'm actually forced to do the opposite again, because the volumes that we deal with, like Aaron said, we go to people and we say, okay, we need a production run on displays, LCD displays or components, and their prototype runs at best compared to what automotive and others would do. So we are left with few options, and we've had to be creative in that regard, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
an interesting, I'm going to say, dichotomy.
Yeah, so not that none of you see the need to change, it's just that, change is easier said than done, I suppose. So I'd like to dive into some of the more specific points that our friends in the audience are bringing up. We've got one gentleman, for instance, who says that he now essentially works on the assumption that, any task that he needs doing, I think he's talking maintenance tasks, are going to take 30 to 45 days longer to get completed. And one of his colleagues is asking, with specific reference to engines, but I think it would apply to other aircraft components too. As a result of this situation, do we think that some engines and aircraft components that are perhaps older are going to end up getting phased out as a result of this? Because it's just going to be, they're not going to be used as much, and they're going to be more expensive to maintain. So, Mark, what do you think? Do you see much, is this going to sort of flush some hardware out of the system because it just becomes unviable for whatever reason?
I can only imagine you'll see some rationalization of those sort of things, where the root supplier says this is just not worth it. It's particularly where you see volume dips, and something just becomes not worth the time and energy to support, or a temporary hit to demand is going to cause certain folks to close their doors and then probably not reopen, and so that's going to remove certain pieces from supply chain. So yeah, I think you will see some phasing out of certain things. You'll also see the opposite happen, where there will be a renewed interest in keeping keeping aircraft in the air, extending service life, keeping them going longer rather than investing in brand new materials. So I think that both is likely to happen.
Yeah, for different reasons. That's a good point. Aaron, what about you? Do you think this is going to sort of change attitudes that operators and equipment owners have to some of their hardware? Is it perhaps going to prompt some sort of review of what equipment they've got, or are market conditions going to be such that they sort of have to make the best of what they've got?
Well, I think we see two things happening. I think with ADS-B and now COVID, it's sort of implying a lot of this older equipment isn't going to fly anymore. But we're also looking at what the price of oil is, where it's gone from your largest operating expense to getting closer to free, that it's making some of the older heavy iron actually really economic to operate. So one of the things that happens is this in our industry, as you know, is when the demand goes down for specific aircraft type, the supply goes up because people start parting out the aircraft and it becomes a little bit more economic. So I'm not sure we figured out how it's all going to sort out yet. Part of it, we have been talking to the brokers and trying to get their feedback as to what does this mean for pricing of equipment. What's happened between January 1 and today? And we're hearing everything from 10 to 25%. You've got half the market basically saying, if I can buy an aircraft at a great price, I'm in. And then you got other people saying there's going to be a lot of demand for corporate aircraft. And if you got someone who's desperate, I'm a seller. I think it's going to take it's going to see how long this takes, how quick the recovery is. But most of the trends are saying the older equipment is going to be leaving the market quicker. if I would have to
Yeah.
bet on one side or the other.
Yeah, good point. And Todd, we'll come to you next with much the same question. Do you think this will change attitudes towards investment in new equipment? One of our questioners specifically flags up the problems in the oil industry, and I think what he or she means is, if suddenly the cost of fuel is not such a big issue, perhaps you don't care so much about engine efficiency and so on. Are you seeing much change coming in that regard?
Yes, I am. As a matter of fact, as we have been reaching out to many of our customers, if not all of our customers, and that's a big job because our customer base is around 5,000 businesses out there. So we have definitely seen that specifically, that there are some things that are no longer available, or where people have decided only to do required maintenance and not to do upgrades. In avionics with ADS-B and other upgrade opportunities, that's been a huge part of the market. But we have specifically had people tell us that their opinion or what they're seeing with their customers is people are varying away from that discretionary spending. And I think it also depends on the market segment. Like Aaron, we also own and operate an aircraft, but this year we had plans to do, I think it was 52 meetings and shows, trade shows, and that has almost been, if not virtually completely eliminated from our calendar, and the money that we would have spent traveling to those events and using our aircraft, we don't have that need. We will still keep our aircraft because it's such a great tool for us. And that's why we tell our customers, we fly with you, because we know exactly the pressure. And as a side note, I'm concerned because I love aviation, and my goal when I was 5 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a pilot. And I'm very concerned about the casual flyer, the people that have, held on to that 172 or that Bonanza because they love to fly. I'm really concerned about the pressure on that part of the market, the people that fly because they can and they've held on to that. And, what will this pressure put on that as for people where it is discretionary as opposed to maybe being a critical business tool?
Yeah.
So I worry about that somewhat.
Yeah, good point. Here's another question from our audience. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to grasp this better than perhaps I am. Somebody is asking, with the number of aircraft currently parked, how does used serviceable material play into the supply chain model? I think they're asking, are we going to see materials that are serviceable and can be reused have their sort of life extended? Mark, what do you think about that? Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, definitely. Used serviceable material will definitely be an opportunity. It's something that's a key part of our business today. There will probably be, I think, a large availability of used serviceable material coming, and then folks, as I mentioned earlier, folks with cash will have the opportunity. I think there are going to be great opportunities to secure inventory at favorable pricing, but it's a little bit like catching a falling knife, and timing will be critical. And some people will really luck out and benefit from it, and other folks won't. But I think just the nature of used serviceable material will continue to be really important to us, but just to the overall aerospace supply chain.
Yes, good point. What about you, Aaron? Do you have any views on used serviceable material and their significance?
We agree with Mark. It's always been an important part of the industry. It's going to increase even further. So we're doing the same thing. We're right now looking and trying to be aggressive buyers in that market, look for the opportunities.
Yeah, good. Okay. Todd, just switching to you with a slightly different question. Somebody is saying, how quickly will additive manufacturing be incorporated into the supply chain? And do we think, the lessons learned from the current situation and the economic pressures will perhaps advance that movement in our industry?
Yes, well, as Mark mentioned, additive manufacturing, which some people call, printing, it's actually goes so much deeper than that, and it has so much more capability. That makes a lot of sense. I know when I go to the dentist office, now they can do that right there,
Yeah.
where they don't have to send out and help keep my teeth in good order. They can make the part while I'm sitting in the chair. So I think a lot of people will migrate. So yeah, I guess if you want to buy stock in an up and coming sector, additive manufacturing would definitely be a good area.
Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting. And then we'll go back into the sequence for this question. Somebody's asking, basically, several of you mentioned that with aircraft being on the ground more at the moment, some people are wisely taking the opportunity to have various MRO tasks done, perhaps changing the schedule in which they're done. And this questioner is basically saying when things return to whatever normal is going to be, could that mean that companies like yours suddenly are going to see a dip in demand for your MRO services because people had all this work done during the downtime? And does that matter? Maybe there are other revenue streams that you would care about more at that point. So Aaron, starting with you, do you see that trend happening when we get back to normal, hopefully in a few weeks or months?
Right. Hopefully we'll get back to normal soon. It's possible, but I think the market is so big that I don't think we're too concerned about that. I mean, we're trying to keep up with the demand now for those areas that are described as where people are moving up the calendar. But no, we don't see it as a major concern. We just want to see this industry get back to running again, and hopefully that'll keep everybody busy.
Absolutely. What about you, Todd? Do you see any sort of shakeout in terms of the type of work you're doing in a few months' time?
Well, we are concerned about that. Absolutely. The question is how long, and what is our new normal? Because I think everybody agrees that whatever normal is will be different for us. And I hesitate to give advice too much, but I have been working with my key people in my organization and advice to others that we did learn lessons in the last recession. And to a very significant extent, even though this is different because of the health crisis and the pandemic, I think that the recovery will be in many ways very similar to the previous economic situation that we saw. The timing could be different, but I think we'll see, progress forward and then maybe some fallback. So I think if we look back into our experience and the things that served us well in the last recession, I think a lot of those things will help us in the near future. And we also, of course, all look forward to that new normal and being back in a place where we can function more the way that people want to live their lives.
Yes, good point. And then for you, Mark, I mean, do you expect the pattern of MRO work that you do in your group, Standard Aero, to change much as flying operations resume? I mean, is it the case that your teams have been doing, a year's worth of MRO in 2 or 3 months, and now suddenly you're going to face an empty period?
I think there will be inevitably a little bit of a slowdown just because everyone's going to be so excited about the opportunity to go fly. You can imagine that if, just pick a date out of thin air, if June 1st, the world suddenly becomes comfortable with traveling again, and I'm responsible for the operation of an aircraft, I probably don't want to tell my principal that I've just put the airplane down for 2 months.
Yes.
So I think there's just going to be a natural desire to have assets available to fly as we start to open up borders and transportation again. But I think that's going to be, a relatively short period. I don't think it's going to be a massive impact to us or to the industry. It's just a dynamic we all have to be aware of. And then, how do we stay focused on the long-term new normal, and how do demand patterns settle in once that takes hold? I think it will affect demand for us in all aspects of what we do. And it's going to take some time to digest those new patterns, and we'll have to be very quick to adapt to them. So we have to create flexibility and be ready to adapt quickly.
Yeah. Okay, that's very good. And that sort of brings us to what I think will have to be our final question. I'm just very quickly sort of synthesizing various questions together. But back to you, Todd, back to you, Aaron, probably one last time. Some questioners are saying, okay, even before COVID, there were certain parts and components that were already pretty hard to get in a timely way, like bearing races, for example. So the questioners are saying, do you expect that once the worst of the crisis passes, that a more normal supply chain can resume in a fairly timely way for parts that people had been struggling to get when they wanted them?
Well, we hope it returns somewhat to normal, but I think it's going to be a challenge because, as our engineering group pointed out, when the market recovers, the question is, are those bearing people, and that was the example we used internally, are they going to be focused on getting us up to speed, or are they going to be worried about the auto industry? That's part of the challenge. And as Todd said, that's a very, very specialized business that there are very few potential suppliers. So hopefully it'll recover, but I think we're probably not going to be first on people's radar scope to be concerned about.
That's a good point. What about you, Todd? Do you think that that there could still be some sort of kinks in the supply chain for things that were already difficult to source, or do you think that the dip in demand will perhaps balance that out and level things to some degree?
Well, again, I think we see in the short term, we see some balance, and that's exactly what we are experiencing within our facility and within our business. But hearing what Mark said as well, it helps me center myself that a lot of the things that were really important before the pandemic are still extremely relevant and are things that would make a big difference in a strong recovery. And I hope that our friends, all the people in the General Aviation Manufacturers Association, are listening, and are very good friends at the FAA and EASA and other authorities. But things like the ODA situation, those are the things that will make a huge difference in an effective recovery. And many of those things were already critical efforts and programs and areas that needed to be addressed. So if we can get back to dealing with those key issues, I think it will serve us well.
Good. Okay. And finally, you, Mark, what do you think it will take to kind of get the supply chain back to where it ought to be?
But that's a loaded question.
It is. I'll save the best for last.
Yeah, I think the more we can all try to adapt to the realities that are coming our way and make lasting changes, whether it be increasing or decreasing points in the supply chain, and minimize sort of the real strong stop and start, to try to get to a more normal pace over time. I think the kinks that pre-existed COVID are going to continue to be a problem for us. And I think that's an area of concern for me, because folks that were going to deal with those kinks in the supply chain are probably very reticent to be spending money right now to deal with any of those kinks, because they're not sure if the supply demand dynamic has changed just yet. So I think we're in for a little bit of a bumpy ride here. And all of us, whether we be consumers or suppliers or both, trying to be measured and thoughtful and not overreact one way or the other, I think helps all parts of the supply chain. And as I mentioned before, really open communication with our suppliers and customers about how these things are affecting us and what we need. We've already had spent a lot of time over the past couple of weeks talking to our suppliers about what we need from them and how we need them to support the supply chain better and what we expect going forward. So I think, it's, like I said, it's going to be a bumpy ride, but but there is an opportunity to sort of smooth some of those bumps out if we're thoughtful about it, and would encourage everybody to not overreact one way or the other, because typically you end up regretting that.
No, quite understandable. Well, listen, I appreciate all of you for being so candid in addressing this issue, and most of you have. It's great to hear that you're ultimately taking a sort of glass half full view of this and seeing the opportunity there. But I am going to have to let our experts get back to work, get back to their respective supply chain customers, or they're going to start calling me asking where they are. So on behalf of AIN's global audience, I'd like to thank our experts today: Aaron Hollander with First Aviation, Todd Winter with Mid-Continent, and Mark Drobny, who you just heard from there from Standard Aero. It's been great talking with you. And audience, thank you for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to absolutely everybody today. We appreciate you spending time with us. And if we didn't get your question, we'll try and follow up later. Now, next week, next Tuesday, April 28th, please come back at the same time, the same place. We're going to be talking about the business aviation training sector. And it's going to be AIN Editor-in-Chief Matt Thurber who will be leading that discussion. We're going to be talking about how flight crew and maintenance personnel can keep their currency in these complicated times. So again, thank you all for being with us today. Thank you all for sharing information. It's great to get together. Please take care. We look forward to talking to you soon. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you, Charles. Fly safe, be safe, wash your hands.
Yeah.
Thank you.